Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody comes back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
Hello, my name's Tony Walker and welcome to another episode of the Classic Ghost Stories podcast. This week I'm going to be reading you a story from this book. This is going to be a story this week from Alfred Hitchcock Presents Stories for Late at Night, and I'm sure that Alfred Hitchcock never actually read any of these stories, or he may have done, but it's completely incidental and his name is being used for a marketing reason. Anyway, this story I'm going to read this week is The Whistling Room by William Hope Hodgson. It's a Carnacki, the ghost hunter story. I've never read any of Carnacki's stories before, yet I've read detective stories and I've read ghost stories and I've been asked to do Carnacki, but I've never done it, so here goes. The Whistling Room by William Hope Hodgson. Carnacki shook a friendly fist at me as I entered, late. Then he opened the door into the dining room and ushered the four of us, Jessup, Arkwright, Taylor and myself, into dinner. We dined well, as usual, and equally as usual, Carnacki was pretty silent during the meal. At the end, we took our wine and cigars to our accustomed positions, and Carnacki, having got himself comfortable in his big chair, began without any preliminary. "I've just got back from Ireland again," he said, "and I thought you chaps would be interested to hear my news. Besides, I fancy I shall see the thing clearer after I've told it all out straight. I must tell you this, though, at the beginning. Up to the present moment, I've been utterly and completely stumped. I have tumbled upon one of the most peculiar cases of haunting, or devilment of some sort, that I've ever come against. Now listen. I have been spending the last few weeks at Eastre Castle, about 20 miles northeast of Galway. I got a letter about a month ago from a Mr. Sid K. Tassock, who, it seemed, had bought the place lately and moved in, only to find that he had got a very peculiar piece of property. When I reached there, he met me at the station and drove me up to the castle. I found that he was pegging it there with his boy brother and another American who seemed to be half servant and half companion. It appears that all the servants had left the place in a body, as you might say, and now they were managing among themselves, assisted by some day help. The three of them got together a scratch feed, and Tassock told me all about the trouble whilst we were at table. It's most extraordinary and different from anything that I've had to do with, though that buzzing case was very queer too. Tassock began right in the middle of his story. "We've got a room in this shanty," he said, "which has got a most infernal whistling in it, sort of haunting it. The thing starts any time, you never know when, and it goes on until it frightens you. It's not ordinary whistling, and it isn't the wind. Wait till you hear it. We're all carrying guns," said the boy, and slapped his coat pocket. "As bad as that?" I said, and the older brother nodded. "I may be soft," he replied, "but wait till you've heard it. Sometimes I think it's some infernal thing, and the next moment I'm just as sure that someone's playing a trick on us." "Why?" I asked. "What's to be gained?" "You mean," he said, "that people usually have some good reason for playing tricks as elaborate as this? Well, I'll tell you. There's a lady in this province by the name of Miss Donahue who's going to be my wife this day 2 months. She's more beautiful than they make them, and so far as I can see, I've just stuck my head into an Irish hornet's nest. There's about a score of hot young Irishmen been courting her these 2 years gone, and now that I've come along and cut them out, they feel raw against me. Do you begin to understand the possibilities?" "Yes," I said, "perhaps I do in some vague sort of way, but I don't see how all this affects the room." "Like this," he said. "When I'd fixed it up with Miss Donahue, I looked out for a place and bought this one. Afterwards I told her one evening during dinner that I decided to tie up here, and then she asked me whether I wasn't afraid of the whistling room. I told her it must have been thrown in gratis, as I'd heard nothing about it. There were some of her men friends present, and I saw a smile go round. I found out, after a bit of questioning, that several people have bought this place during the last 20-odd years, and it was always on the market again after a trial. Well, the chaps started to bait me a bit and offered to take bets after dinner that I'd not stay 6 months in this shanty. I looked once or twice at Miss Donahue, but I could see that she didn't take it as a joke at all. Partly, I think, because there was a bit of a sneer in the way the men were tackling me, and partly because she really believed there is something in this yarn of the whistling room. However, after dinner I did what I could to even things up with the others. I nailed all their bets and screwed them down good and safe. I guess some of them are going to be hard hit, unless I lose, which I don't mean to. Well, there you have practically the whole yarn. Not quite, I told him. All that I know is that you have bought a castle with a room in it that is in some way queer, and that you've been doing a bit of betting. Also, I know that your servants have got frightened and run away. Tell me something about the whistling. Oh, that, said Tassoc. That started the second night we were in. I'd had a good look around the room in the daytime, as you can understand, for the talk-up at Arlestray, Miss Donahue's place. It had me wonder a bit. But it seems just as usual as some of the other rooms in the old wing, only perhaps a bit more loathsome feeling, but that may only be because of the talk about it, you know. The whistling started about 10 o'clock on the second night, as I said. Tom and I were in the library when we heard an awfully queer whistling coming along the east corridor. The room is in the west wing, you know. That's the blessed ghost, I said to Tom, and we collared the lamps off the table and went up to have a look. I tell you, even as we dug along the corridor, it took me a bit in the throat. It was so beastly queer. It was a sort of tune in a way, but more as if a devil or some rotten thing were laughing at you and going to get round at your back. That's how it makes you feel. When we got to the door, we didn't wait, but rushed it open. And then, I tell you, the sound of the thing fairly hit me in the face. Tom said he got it the same way. Sort of felt stunned and bewildered. We looked all around and soon got so nervous we just cleared out and I locked the door. We came down here and had a stiff drink each. Then we felt better and began to feel we'd been nicely had. So we took sticks and went out into the grounds, thinking, after all, it must be some of these confounded Irishmen working the ghost trick on us. But there was nothing stirring. We went back into the house and walked over it and then paid another visit to the room. But we simply couldn't stand it. We fairly ran out and locked the door again. I don't know how to put into words, but I had a feeling of being up against something that was rottenly dangerous. You know, we've carried our guns ever since. Of course, we had a real turnout of the room next day and the whole place, and we even hunted down the grounds, but there was nothing queer. And now, I don't know what to think, except that the sensible part of me tells me that it's some plan of these wild Irishmen to try and take a rise out of me. Done anything since? I asked him. Yes, he said. Watched outside of the door of the room at night and chased round the grounds and sounded the walls and floor of the room. We've done everything we could think of, and it's beginning to get on our nerves. So we sent for you. By this time, we had finished eating. As we rose from the table, Tassoc suddenly called out, "Shh, listen." We were instantly silent, listening. Then I heard it, an extraordinary hooning whistle, monstrous and inhuman, coming from far away through corridors to my right. "By God," said Tassoc, "and it's scarcely dark yet. Collar those candles, both of you, and come along." In a few moments we were all out of the door and racing up the stairs. Tassoc turned into a long corridor, and we followed, shielding our candles as we ran. The sounds seemed to fill all the passages as we drew near, until I had the feeling that the whole air throbbed under the power of some wanton, immense force. A sense of an actual taint, as you might say, of monstrosity all about us. Tassoc unlocked the door then, giving it a push with his foot, jumped back and drew his revolver. As the door flew open, the sound beat out at us with an effect impossible to explain to one who hasn't heard it, with a certain horrible personal note in it, as if in the darkness you could picture the room rocking and creaking in a mad, vile glee to its own filthy piping and whistling and hooning, and yet all of the time aware of you in particular. To stand there and listen was to be stunned by realization. It was as if someone showed you the mouth of a vast pit suddenly and said, "That's hell." And you knew that they'd spoken the truth. Do you get it? Even a little bit. I stepped a pace into the room and held the candle over my head and looked quickly round. Tassoc and his brother joined me, and the man came up at the back, and we all held our candles high. I was deafened with the shrill piping hoon of the whistling, and then, clear in my ear, something seemed to be saying to me, "Get out of here! Quick, quick, quick!" As you chaps know, I never neglect that sort of thing. Sometimes it may be nothing but nerves, but as you will remember, it was just such a warning that saved me in the grey dog case and in the yellow finger experiments, as well as other times. Well, I turned sharp round to the others. "Out!" I said. "For God's sake, out! Quick!" And in an instant I had them in the passage. There came an extraordinary yelling scream into the hideous whistling, and then, like a clap of thunder, an utter silence. I slammed the door and locked it. Then, taking the key, I looked round at the others. They were pretty white, and I imagine I must have looked that way too. And there we stood a moment, silent. "Come down out of this and have some whiskey," said Tassoc at last, in a voice he tried to make ordinary, and he led the way. I was the back man, and I knew we all kept looking over our shoulders. When we got downstairs, Tassoc passed the bottle round. He took a drink himself and slapped his glass onto the table, then sat down with a thud. "That's a lively thing to have in your house with you, isn't it?" he said. And directly afterwards, "What on earth made you hustle us all out like that, Carnacki?" "Something seemed to be telling me to get out quick," I said. "Sounds a bit silly, superstitious, I know, but when you're meddling with this sort of thing, you've got to take notice of queer fancies and risk being laughed at." I told him then about the grey dog business, and he nodded a lot to that. "Of course," I said, "this may be nothing more than those would-be rivals of yours playing some funny game, but personally, though, I'm going to keep an open mind. I feel that there is somewhat beastly and dangerous about this thing." We talked for a while longer, and then Tassoc suggested billiards, which we played in a pretty half-hearted fashion, and all the time cocking an ear to the door for sounds. But none came. And later, after coffee, he suggested early bed and a thorough overhaul of the room in the morning. My bedroom was in the newer part of the castle, and the door opened into the picture gallery. At the east end of the gallery was the entrance to the corridor of the east wing. This was shut off from the gallery by two old and heavy oak doors, which looked rather odd and quaint beside the more modern doors of the various rooms. When I reached my room, I didn't go to bed, but began to unpack my instrument trunk. I intended to take one or two preliminary steps at once in my investigation of the extraordinary whistling. Presently, when the castle had settled into quietness, I slipped out of my room and across to the entrance of the great corridor. I opened one of the low, squat doors and threw the beam of my pocket searchlight down the passage. It was empty, and I went through the doorway and pushed to the oak behind me. Then, along the great passageway, throwing my light before and behind and keeping my revolver handy. I had hung a protection belt of garlic round my neck, and the smell of it seemed to fill the corridor and give me assurance, for as you all know, It is a wonderful protection against the more usual airy forms of semi-materialization by which I suppose the whistling might be produced, though at that period of my investigation I was still quite prepared to find it due to some perfectly natural case. For it is astonishing the enormous number of cases that prove to have nothing abnormal in them. In addition to wearing the necklet, I had plugged my ears loosely with garlic, and as I did not intend to stay more than a few minutes in the room, I hoped to be safe. When I reached the door and put my hand into my pocket for the key, I had a sudden feeling of sickening funk. But I wasn't going to back out of it if I could help it. I unlocked the door and turned the handle. Then I gave the door a sharp push with my foot, as Tassic had done, and drew my revolver, though I didn't expect to have any use for it, really. I shone the searchlight all round the room and then stepped inside with a disgustingly horrible feeling of walking slap into awaiting danger. I stood a few seconds, expectant, and nothing happened, and the empty room showed bare from corner to corner. And then, I realized that the room was full of a purposeful silence, just as sickening as any of the filthy noises the things have power to make. Do you remember what I told you about the silent garden business? Well, this room had just that same malevolent silence, the beastly quietness of a thing that is looking at you and not seeable itself and thinks that it has got you. Oh, I recognized it instantly, and I slipped the top off my lantern so as to have light over the whole room. Then I set to working like fury in keeping my glance all about me. I sealed the 2 windows with lengths of human hair right across, and sealed them at every frame. As I worked, a queer, scarcely perceptible tenseness stole into the air of the place, and the silence seemed, if you can understand me, to grow more solid. I knew then that I had no business there without full protection, for I was practically certain that this was no mere airy development, but one of the worst forms, such as the Saiti, like the grunting man case. You remember? I finished the window and hurried over to the great fireplace. This is a huge affair and has a queer gallows iron, I think they're called, projecting from the back of the arch. I sealed the opening with 7 human hairs, the 7th crossing the 6 others. Then, just as I was making an end, a low, mocking whistle grew in the room. A cold, nervous prickling went up my spine and round my forehead from the back. The hideous sound filled the room with an extraordinary, grotesque parody of human whistling, too gigantic to be human, as if something gargantuan and monstrous made the sound softly. As I stood there a last moment, pressing down the final seal, I had little doubt but that I had come across one of those rare and horrible cases of the inanimate reproducing the functions of the animate. I made a grab for my lamp and went quickly to the door, looking over my shoulder and listening for the thing that I expected. It came just as I got my hand on the handle, a squeal of incredible malevolent anger piercing through the low hooning of the whistling. I dashed out, slamming the door and locking it. I leant a little against the opposite wall of the corridor, feeling rather funny, for it had been a hideously narrow squeak. There be no safety to be gained by guards of holiness when the monster hath power to speak through wood and stone. So runs the passage in the Zigzand manuscript, and I proved it in that nodding door business. There is no protection against this particular form of monster, except possibly for a fractional period of time, for it can reproduce itself in or take to its purposes the very protective material which you may use, and has power to form within the pentacle, though not immediately. There is, of course, the possibility of the unknown last line of the Sama ritual being uttered, but it is too uncertain to count upon, and the danger is too hideous, and even then it has no power to protect for more than maybe 5 beats of the heart, as the Zigzand has it. Inside of the room there was now a constant meditative hooning, whistling. But presently this ceased, and the silence seemed worse, for there is such a sense of hidden mischief in a silence. After a little I sealed the door with crossed hairs, and then cleared off down the great passage, and so to bed. For a long time I lay awake, but managed eventually to get some sleep. Yet about 2 o'clock I was waked by the hooning whistling of the room coming to me, even through the closed doors. The sound was tremendous, and seemed to beat through the whole house with a presiding sense of terror, as if, I remember thinking, some monstrous giant had been holding mad carnival with itself at the end of that great passage. I got up and sat on the edge of the bed, wondering whether to go along and have a look at the seal, and suddenly there came a thump on my door, and Tassoc walked in with his dressing gown over his pyjamas. I thought it would have waked you, so I came along to have a talk, he said. I can't sleep. Beautiful, isn't it? Extraordinary, I said, and tossed him my case. He lit a cigarette, and we sat and talked for about an hour, and all the time that noise went down at the end of the big corridor. Suddenly Tassoc stood up. "Let's take our guns and go and examine the brute," he said, and turned towards the door. "No," I said. "By Jove, no. I can't say anything definite yet, but I believe that the room is about as dangerous as it well can be." "Haunted? Really haunted?" he asked keenly and without any of his frequent banter. I told him, of course, that I couldn't say a definite yes or no to such a question, but that I hoped to be able to make a statement soon. Then I gave him a little lecture on the false rematerialization of the animate force through the inanimate inert. He began then to understand the particular way in which the room might be dangerous if it were really the subject of a manifestation. About an hour later, the whistling ceased quite suddenly, and Tassoc went off again to bed. I went back to mine also, and eventually got another spell of sleep. In the morning, I walked along to the room. I found the seals of the door intact. Then I went in. The window seals and the hair were all right, but the 7th hair across the great fireplace was broken. This set me thinking. I knew that it might very possibly have snapped through my having tensioned it too highly. But then again, it might have been broken by something else. Yet it was scarcely possible that a man, for instance, could have passed between the 6 unbroken hairs, for no one would ever have noticed them, entering the room that way, you see, but just walked through them, ignorant of their very existence. I removed the other hairs and the seals. Then I looked up the chimney. It went up straight, and I could see blue sky at the top. It was a big open flue and free from any suggestion of hiding places or corners. Yet, of course, I didn't trust any such casual examination, and after breakfast I put on my overalls and climbed to the very top, sounding all the way. But I found nothing. Then I came down and went over the whole of the room, floor, ceiling, and the walls, mapping them out in 6-inch squares and sounding with both hammer and probe. But there was nothing unusual. Afterwards, I made a 3-week search of the whole castle in the same thorough way, but found nothing. I went even further then for a night, when the whistling commenced. I made a microphone test. You see, if the whistling were mechanically produced, this test would have made evident to me the working of the machinery, if there were any such concealed within the walls. It certainly was an up-to-date method of examination, as you must allow. Of course, I did not think that any of Tassock's rivals had fixed up any mechanical contrivance, but I thought it just possible that there had been some such thing for producing the whistling, made way back in the years, perhaps with the intention of giving the room a reputation that would ensure of its being free of inquisitive folk. You see what I mean? Well, of course, it was just possible, if this were the case, that someone knew the secret of the machinery and was utilizing the knowledge to play this devil of a prank on Tassock. The microphone test of the walls would certainly have made this known to me, so I have said, but there was nothing of the sort in the castle, so that I had practically no doubt at all now, but that it was a genuine case of what is popularly termed a haunting. All this time, every night, and sometimes most of each night, the hooning whistling of the room was intolerable. It was as if an intelligence there knew that steps were being taken against it, and piped and hooned in a sort of mad, mocking contempt. I tell you, it was as extraordinary as it was horrible. Time after time I went along, tiptoeing noiselessly on stockinged feet to the sealed door, for I always kept the room sealed. I went at all hours of the night, and often the whistling inside would seem to change to a brutally jeering note, as though the half-animate monster saw me plainly through the shut door. And all the time, as I would stand, watching, the hooning of the whistling would seem to fill the whole corridor, so that I used to feel a precious lonely chap messing about there with one of hell's mysteries. And every morning I would enter the room and examine the different hairs and seals. You see, after the first week, I had stretched parallel hairs all along the walls of the room and along the ceiling, but over the floor, which was of polished stone, I had set out little colourless wafers, sticky side uppermost. Each wafer was numbered and then arranged after a definite plan, so that I should be able to trace the exact movement of any living thing that went across. You will see that no material being or creature could possibly have entered that room without leaving many signs to tell me about it. But nothing was ever disturbed, and I began to think that I should have to risk an attempt to stay a night in the room in the electric pentacle. Mind you, I knew that it would be a crazy thing to do, but I was getting stumped and ready to try anything. Once, about midnight, I did break the seal on the room and have a quick look in. But I tell you, the whole room gave one mad yell and seemed to come towards me in a great belly of shadows, as if the walls had bellied in towards me. Of course, that must have been fancy. Anyway, the yell was sufficient, and I slammed the door and locked it, feeling a bit weak down my spine. I wonder whether you know that feeling. And then, when I had got into that state of readiness for anything, I made what at first I thought was something of a discovery. It was about 1 a.m, and I was walking slowly round the castle, keeping in the soft grass. I'd come under the shadow of the east front, and far above me I could hear the vile hooning whistling of the room up in the darkness of the unlit wing. Then, suddenly, a little in front of me, I heard a man's voice speaking low, but evidently in glee. "By George, you chaps, but I wouldn't care to bring a wife home to that," it said in a tone of the cultured Irish. Someone started to reply, but there came a sharp exclamation and then a rush, and I heard footsteps running in all directions. Evidently the men had spotted me. For a few seconds I stood there feeling an awful ass. After all, they were at the bottom of the haunting. Do you see what a big fool it made me seem? I had no doubt but they were some of Tassock's rivals, and here I had been feeling in every bone that I had hit a genuine case. And then, there came a memory of hundreds of details that made me just as much in doubt again. Anyway, whether it was natural or abnatural, there was a great deal yet to be cleared up. I told Tassock next morning what I discovered, and through the whole of every night for 5 nights we kept a close watch round the east wing. But there was never a sign of anyone prowling about. And all this time, almost from evening to dawn, that grotesque whistling would hoon incredibly far above us in the darkness. On the morning after the 5th night, I received a wire from here which brought me home by the next boat. I explained to Tassic that I was simply bound to come away for a few days, but I told him to keep up the watch around the castle. One thing I was very careful to do, and that was to make him absolutely promise never to go into the room between sunset and sunrise. I made it clear to him that we knew nothing definite yet, one way or the other, and if the room were what I had first thought it to be, it might be a lot better for him to die first than enter it after dark. When I got here and had finished my business, I thought you chaps would be interested, and also I wanted to get it all spread out clear in my mind, so I rang you up. I'm going over again tomorrow, and when I get back, I ought to have something pretty extraordinary to tell you. By the way, there is a curious thing I forgot to tell you. I tried to get a phonographic record of the whistling, but it simply produced no impression on the wax at all. That's one of the things that made me feel queer. Another extraordinary thing is that the microphone will not magnify the sound, will not even transmit it, seems to take no account of it and acts as if it were non-existent. I'm absolutely and utterly stumped up to the present. I'm a wee bit curious to see whether any of you dear clever heads can make daylight of it. I cannot, not yet. He rose to his feet. "Good night, all," he said, and began to usher us out abruptly, but without offence, into the night. A fortnight later, he dropped us each a card, and you can imagine that I was not late this time. When we arrived, Carnacki took us straight into dinner, and when we'd finished and all made ourselves comfortable, he began again where he had left off. "Now, just listen quietly, for I've got something very queer to tell you. I got back late at night, and I had to walk up to the castle, as I hadn't warned them that I was coming. It was bright moonlight, so that the walk was rather a pleasure than otherwise. When I got there, the whole place was in darkness, and I thought I would go round outside to see whether Tassic or his brother was keeping watch. But I couldn't find him anywhere, and concluded that they'd got tired of it and gone off to bed. As I returned across the lawn that lies below the front of the east wing, I caught the hooning whistling of the room coming down strangely clear through the stillness of the night. It had a peculiar note in it, as I remember, low and constant, queerly meditative. I looked up at the window, bright in the moonlight, and got a sudden thought to bring a ladder from the stable yard and try to get a look into the room from the outside. With this notion, I hunted round at the back of the castle among the straggle of the office, and presently found a long, fairly light ladder, though it was heavy enough for one, goodness knows. I thought at first that I should never get it reared. I managed at last, and let the ends rest very quietly against the wall, a little below the sill of the larger window. Then, going silently, I went up the ladder. Presently, I had my face above the sill and was looking in, alone, with the moonlight. Of course, the queer whistling sounded louder up there, but it still conveyed that peculiar sense of something whistling quietly to itself. Can you understand? Though, for all the meditative lowness of the tone, the horrible, gargantuan quality was distinct, a mighty parody of the human. As if I stood there and listened to the whistling from the lips of a monster with a man's soul. And then, I saw something. The floor in the middle of the huge empty room was puckered upwards in the centre into a strange soft-looking mound, parted at the top into an ever-changing hole that pulsated to that great gentle hooning. At times, as I watched, I saw the heaving of the indented mound gap across with a queer inward suction, as with the drawing of an enormous breath. Then the thing would dilate and pout once more to the incredible melody, and suddenly, as I stared, dumb, it came to me that the thing was living. I was looking at two enormous blackened lips, blistered and brutal, there in the pale moonlight. Abruptly they bulged out to a vast pounding mound of force and sound, stiffened and swollen and hugely massive and clean cut in the moonbeams, and a great sweat lay heavy on the vast upper lip. In the same moment of time the whistling had burst into a mad screaming note that seemed to stun me even where I stood outside of the window, and then, the following moment, I was staring blankly at the solid undisturbed floor of the room, smooth polished stone flooring from wall to wall. And there was an absolute silence. You can picture me staring into the quiet room and knowing what I knew. I felt a sick, frightened child, and I wanted to slide quietly down the ladder and run away. But in that very instant I heard Tassock's voice calling to me from within the room for help. Help, my God! But I got such an awful dazed feeling, and I had a vague, bewildered notion that after all it was the Irishmen who'd got in there and were taking it out of him. And then the call came again, and I burst the window and jumped in to help him. I had a confused idea that the call had come from within the shadow of the great fireplace, and I raced across to it, but there was no one there. "Tassock!" I shouted, and my voice went empty-sounding round the great apartment, and then, in a flash, I knew that Tassock had never called. I whirled round, sick with fear, towards the window, and as I did so, a frightful, exultant, whistling scream burst through the room. On my left, the end wall had bellied in towards me in a pair of gargantuan lips, black and utterly monstrous, to within a yard of my face. I fumbled for a mad instant at my revolver, not for it, but myself, for the danger was 1,000 times worse than death. And then suddenly the unknown last line of the Samar ritual was whispered quite audibly in the room. Instantly the thing happened that I have known once before. There came a sense as of dust falling continually and monotonously, and I knew that my life hung uncertain and suspended for a flash in a brief reeling vertigo of unseeable things. Then that ended, and I knew that I might live. My soul and body blended again, and life and power came to me. I dashed furiously at the window and hurled myself out head foremost, for I can tell you that I had stopped being afraid of death. I crashed down onto the ladder and slithered, grabbing, and so came, some way or other, alive, to the bottom. And there I sat, on the soft, wet grass, with the moonlight all around me, and far above, through the broken window of the room, there was a low whistling. I wasn't hurt, and went to the front and knocked. When they let me in, we had a long yarn over some good whisky, for I was shaken to pieces, and I explained things as much as I could. I told Tassock that the room would have to come down and every fragment of it be burned in a blast furnace erected within a pentacle. He nodded. There was nothing to say. Then I went to bed. We turned a small army onto the work, and within 10 days that lovely thing had gone up in smoke, and what was left was calcined and clean. It was when the workmen were stripping the panelling that I got hold of a sound notion of the beginnings of that beastly development. Over the great fireplace, after the great oak panels had been torn down, I found that there was let into the masonry a scrollwork of stone with on it an old inscription in ancient Celtic, that here in this room was burned Dian Tianse, jester of King Alzoth, who made the song of foolishness upon King Ernor of the 7th castle. When I got the translation clear, I gave it to Tassock. He was tremendously excited, for he knew the old tale, and took me down to the library to look at an old parchment that gave the story in detail. Afterwards, I found that the incident was well known about the countryside, but always regarded more as a legend than as history, and no one seemed ever to have dreamt that the old east wing of Istray Castle was the remains of the ancient 7th castle. From the old parchment I gathered that there had been a pretty dirty job done way back in the years. It seems that King Alsorf and King Ernor had been enemies by birthright, as you might say, truly, but that nothing more than a little raiding had occurred on either side for years, until Dian Tianse made that song of foolishness upon King Ernor and sang it before King Alsorf. And so greatly was it appreciated that King Alsorf gave the jester one of his ladies to wife. Presently all the people of the land had come to the song, and so it came at last to King Ernor, who was so angered that he made war upon his old enemy, and took and burned him and his castle. But Dian Tianse, the jester, he brought with him to his own place, and having torn out his tongue because of the song which he had made and sung, he imprisoned him in the room in the east wing, which was evidently used for unpleasant purposes, and the jester's wife he kept for himself, having a fancy for her prettiness. But one night Dian Tianse's wife was not to be found, and in the morning they discovered her lying dead in her husband's arms, and he sitting whistling the song of foolishness, for he had no longer the power to sing it. Then they roasted Dian Tianse in the great fireplace, probably from the self-same gallows iron which I have already mentioned, and until he died Dian Tianse ceased not to whistle the song of foolishness which he could no longer sing. But afterwards, in that room, there was often heard at night the sound of something whistling, and there grew a power in that room, so that none dared to sleep in it. And presently, it would seem, the king went to another castle, for the whistling troubled him. There you have it all. Of course, that is only a rough rendering of the translation from the parchment. It's a bit quaint, don't you think so? Yes, I said, answering for the lot. But how did the thing grow to such a tremendous manifestation? One of those cases of continuity of thought producing a positive action upon the immediate surrounding material, replied Carnacki. The development must have been going forward through centuries to have produced such a monstrosity. It was a true instance of Saiti manifestations, which I can best explain by likening it to a living spiritual fungus which involves the very structure of the ether fibre itself, and of course, in the doing, acquires an essential control over the material substance involved in it. It is impossible to make it plainer in a few words. Then you believe that the room itself had become the material expression of the ancient jester, that his soul, rotted with hatred, had bred into a monster, eh? I asked. Yes, said Carnacki, nodding. I think you've put my thought rather neatly. It is a queer coincidence that Miss Donahue is supposed to be descended, so I heard since, from the same King Ernor. It makes one think some rather curious thoughts, doesn't it? The marriage coming on, and the room waking to fresh life. If she had gone into that room ever, eh? It had waited a long time. Sins of the fathers. Yes, I've thought of that. They're to be married next week, and I'm to be best man, which is a thing I hate. And he won his bets, rather. Just think, if she had gone into that room. Pretty horrible, eh? He nodded his head grimly, and we four nodded back. Then he rose and took us collectively to the door, and presently thrust us forth in friendly fashion onto the embankment and into the fresh night air. Good night, we called back, and went to our various homes. If she had, eh? If she had. That's what I keep thinking.
If you enjoy the Classic Ghost Stories podcast and want to support the show, consider becoming a member on Patreon. You'll get early access to episodes, bonus content, and the feeling of helping keep these haunting tales alive. And if YouTube is your preferred place to listen, you can join as a member there instead. No need to sign up for both. It's the same content either way. So, if you'd like to support the podcast and keep the ghostly tales coming, head over to Patreon or join on YouTube. Either way, every membership helps another tale rise from the grave of the past.
So I messed up the video again. First one I did when I started doing these videos had no picture, second one had no sound, and this third one has the top of my head And what happened was that I'd worked out it was in the right position, and then I did something to move the microphone. It went all wrong. Anyway, the story I've just done was called The Whistling Room, published in 1910 by William Hope Hodgson. I keep looking at my notes, okay? So William Hope Hodgson, let me tell you something about him. He was born in 1877 and died in 1918. He was an author, poet, and a sailor, and he's best known for his works of horror and fantasy fiction, including his novel The House on the Borderland, which is probably his most famous story, and his collection of short stories, The Nightland. Now, I've done some of his work before. He was born in Blackmore End, Essex, to a family of sailors, and he spent much of his childhood at sea. And one of the stories we did, which was The Voice. Voice in the Night, yeah, published 1907, is all about, we'll go and listen to it, but it's about fungus. So fungus crops up in this story as well. So he's obviously interested in fungus, but he spent a lot of time at sea. He left home at the age of 13 and spent the next 18 years of his life at sea, traveling to various parts of the world, including the Arctic and Antarctic. He began writing in his spare time when he was at sea. His first published work was a series of articles on fishing that appeared in the Royal Magazine in 1898, and he later turned to fiction. His first collection of short stories was The Boats of Glen Carrig, and that has fungus in it as well, in the novel's landscape of organic monstrosities. The survivors include weed men and giant fungi in the Sargasso-like wastelands they drift through. So, fungus. We're going to talk about the symbolism of fungus. Now, he joined up in the First World War, and he was a private in the 171st Brigade of the Royal Field Artillery. He was killed in action by an artillery shell at Ypres in Belgium in April 19th, 1918. My great uncle was in the Royal Artillery, and he was killed as well at Besant Ridge. A sapper company had gone forward to clear the area and it had blown up. So, do you know the weird thing is they may have known each other. Um, he was his short career. Lovecraft thought it was great, and you can see why. And Clark Ashton Smith thought he was one of the great masters of the eerie and fantastic. He was also a physical fitness enthusiast and wrote several books on physical culture, including The Physical Training of Children and The Mystery of the Body's Strength. He was an expert in jiu-jitsu and boxing. He was an all-round guy, wasn't he? His novel, The Nightland, is set in a far future in which the sun has died. So, and of course, The House on the Borderland, which one day I'd love to do. This story is Carnacki, the Ghost Finder story, and it was published in the Idler magazine in 1910. The Idler's still going. I just got my copy this morning, and it was one of the early Carnacki cases. It was later collected in the Carnacki books in 1913, and it's like late Edwardian occult detective fiction. Now, I've never done an occult detective before. I've been asked. I did detective fiction, and I've done occult stories, but I never did the occult detective as a whole. So this, and I've been asked to do Carnacki a number of times, and so here we are. Eventually, all things come to those who wait. Let's talk about the occult detective as a genre. I think, I give a lot of credit to Edgar Allan Poe, and Edgar Allan Poe has his detective Auguste Dupin, and he creates the first detective novel, and then he has Poe's story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which sound as if they may be occult. No spoilers, but they're not. And although it's fairly weird, it's fairly weird, the solution. But so I say many times that Gothic fiction, if you look at early Gothic fiction, you're thinking of the Castle of Otranto, the first kind of Gothic novel in the mid 18th century, mid 1700s, 1760 something, top of my mind, I can't remember. And then we have the whole thing of the Gothics, and the Gothics have it all. You have realist fiction at the same time, which is about real people doing real things, and then you have this super duper unbelievable fiction in castles, and it has bodice ripping, it has the quasi titillating, it has the horror, it has the mystery, and so all of the genres of modern fiction that you see in your supermarket or your airport, the police procedural, which arises from the detective story, the horror story, the mucky story, the romance story, they all come from the Gothic. But I think Poe synthesizes, Poe writes obviously the Gothic and the detective story. I just learned in French they're called polar. Polar is a detective thriller story. And I learned that today. And so Poe started off, and there is actually a French, talking about the French, in the early 1828s, there was a French precursor in a Vidocq 1828 memoirs popularized the investigative persona that Poe later creates for his detective. Once you get the detective, and remember that I've just said they all rise from the Gothic novel. So in the early days they're entwined, and so the occult detective is no big surprise really. There is a mystery, and it trips over into the occult. I mean, I've talked before about Scooby-Doo, and Scooby-Dooization is obviously a century or so later, but and that's part of the explained occult, whereby, so I suppose a ghost hunt can turn out in a number of ways, and one is it's a fake, and that is the explained supernatural, was a whole different genre, which I probably talked about before. But this is the occult as occult. So the ghosts in these stories are real, and then the classic we have. Algernon Blackwood has his John Silence, who arrives in 1908. And then we have Diane Fortune's occultist. She's later. The Secret of Dr. Taverner in 1926. And we have Hodgson's stories in 1910. And there are a bunch of people who are these occult detectives. And I think there are even Sherlock Holmes. I used to have a book of Sherlock Holmes Cthulhu stories, and people in the 1980s and 90s had redone. Because if you think about Sherlock Holmes, you have the Adventure of the Sussex Vampire, which could be a cult. No spoilers, it isn't. Or The Hound of the Baskerville, which could be a cult. I've done both of those if you want to go and listen to them. And no spoilers. But, in this case, it is. Now, what is also happening? So we see Carnacki he is really interesting for me because he borrows a lot from the Society for Psychical Research, which was founded in 1882. So we've got this, science to disprove the occult or to prove the occult, and we have parapsychological research, which later goes on and has its there's what's his name, Rhines laboratory, which is doing research on ESP later on. We have Dean Radin, who is much later, he's still working, and we have like the Kerstler parapsychological unit at Edinburgh University. So there's the kind of like the respectable side, and it's using psychology, because what happened, I'm running through things, but in 1882, let's just stick to that, the Society for Psychical Research comes in and tries to have the scientific study of the occult and the paranormal, really. The paranormal, more accurately. And I think Hodgson borrows from that, but it is interesting because when we have and the two worlds drift into each other. We have the scientific study, which is the cousin of cognitive psychology and experimental psychology, and the social science of psychology that has a lot of stats in. I did a degree in psychology, and I was most upset to find it was mainly statistics and seeing if there were observable effects and clinical effects. And Dean Radin does this fantastically, and Ryan did, of course, as well. This scientific study, and of course, if you follow the history of psychology, it is like philosophy and the study of the human mind put on a scientific basis, and it starts off really probably with not Freud isn't the first person to do this, but Freud definitely wanted psychology, and he was a neurologist originally, to have a scientific basis. And of course his stuff later becomes a bit of a is criticized because it kind of goes into quasi dream research and slips of the tongue and secret meanings and all that kind of stuff. So but Freud was definitely a rationalist, and he wanted it to be a scientific study. And then later on we have the psychologists saying this isn't good enough, it's not experimental enough, and you get experimental psychology, and side by side with this you get experimental parapsychology, which Carnacki borrows. These are early days, 1910 for this, but he borrows it, and so he's doing things like sealing the rooms to see if and this is the thing that the SPR did. the Society for Psychic Research, they did all sorts of things like they had, and then you get on to Geiger counters and ultrasound, and the Dragon Project does this in the 1970s with stone circles, and electromagnetic and infrared, and this is what they do. Now, what I was going to say before is how this drifts into from the scientific study of parapsychology into cosplay, which is all these ghost hunts you can go on. And what they'll do is these are people that you pay. I used to lead them, so I know all about it. And you pay money to go to a haunted castle or a haunted house, and they give you EMF meters to record electromagnetic frequencies, and they might give you a kind of a thermometer to see cold spots, and you'll have cameras and you have motion detectors. All of this paraphernalia is borrowed from the scientific study of parapsychology, but it is cosplay. It is a story. It is for entertainment. So this is what Carnacki is as well. Of course, this is a story we're reading, but he borrows that. Now, the other kind of thread that he borrows is at the same time as this scientific study was going on of parapsychology, there was the parallel, I was going to say, brood, which is a Welsh word, torrent of the occult study. So we have people like, talk about some of these people who are like Blackwood, Algernon Blackwood, and Diane Fortune were members of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, so they were occultists as well. So they were interested in that, and I think, although Hope Hodgson wasn't, I don't believe, I'm pretty sure he wasn't, but he borrows the paraphernalia of the garlic and the pentacle, which is amusingly an electric pentacle. So modern times have come. So I think that's the setup of it, and that's its lineage, if you like. One of the things that I found that actually worked for me was, because I'm going to bump in and say it's a frame story, isn't it? So this is a very classic device in ghost stories. Think of Henry James, Turn of the Screw, but also M.R. James does it a lot. The story is given as it has a beginning and end. It's a story that's told. Carnacki tells these stories to his colleagues in a club or in his house, as it turns, over dinner and a nice glass of wine. And so it has that, and I've talked elsewhere about that veil of these things are implausible, but if we put them at arm's length, this is M.R. James said this veil, they become more believable. And also, of course, the defense, if I was to tell you a ghost story and I say, well, I knew a man that this happened to, you might say, oh, come on, Tony, you're pulling my leg. And I go, well, I'm just repeating what I was told, and you get that defensibility of distance, really, and it becomes more plausible. It becomes less, it's not in the full light of day, so we could possibly believe these things. Now, so yeah, the occult paraphernalia. But the other thing that I think works about this is that it is like cases like, I remember reading the Amityville Horror in the 1970s, and you remember that it was, and some people still believe that it's a true story. In the Annabelle Doll story, these are pretty true stories. And there is a case that the SPR investigated. They investigated a whole bunch of them. There were real investigators like this. So people like Harry Price, who famously investigated Borley Rectory, and they had these scientific methods, and Peter Underwood, and he was very disciplined, and he was a long time president of the Ghost Club, and produced really careful studies, surveys as haunted London. Guy Lyon Playfair, he was part of the SPR's Field Brigade, and he worked with Maurice Grosse on the Enfield Poltergeist, and the Langenhoe. I've done something on the Langenhoe hauntings as well. But these are scary because they're purportedly true. And if you read about I'm still on the fence about I mean, people say it's a hoax, the Enfield Poltergeist and also Borley Rectory. But, I'm not convinced. I think that there is some truth in it. And because of that, because Carnacki borrows this successfully, he managed just to create a little bit of a ooh in me as I was reading it. And not many stories scare me, and so I think that was really well done. So let's think about what the story's really about. I think on the surface it works really well as a little scare, and we've talked about his technique of borrowing from occult investigators in the Society for Psychical Research and putting these together. There's the mouth and there's the fungus. The fungus, remember, think about fungus. In Hodgson uses it a lot. It's a symbol of parasitic life. It's a parasite. But of course, in an alchemical sense, fungus is life that's composted. It's something that's died and has come to life again. So it's a symbol of transformation as well. I'm not sure that Hodgson's using it like that, but fungus can be seen in more positive light. He seems to find it as wholly negative, really. So what's going on? Well, there's two ways to look at it. We could look at Freud's return of the repressed. So what we're seeing is something is being pushed into the darkness here. It will not stay hidden. And in support of that idea, we have this thing. The jester's tongue was torn out. He couldn't speak anymore. It's like something wants to speak, but it can't speak. And of course, the unconscious cannot speak our language and so speaks in symbols. And so in a sense, there is a great disquiet in this house, and it cannot use human language. And so it's symbolized by the sound of whistling. Whistling is a way of gaining attention without being able to use words, in a sense. So it's like an inarticulate meaning. There is something that urgently must be told. I've whistled for you. Come here, but I don't have the words to tell you. It cannot be told in words. So it's like the banshee's wail in some senses, which is interesting because it's in Ireland. So in a psychological sense, there is some terrible sin here that will not rest, cannot be pushed away. It will out, and they destroy the house in the end, the room in the end. But it is, and this is a very common thing in ghost stories. There is a sin which has been committed, which will not rest, and it causes great psychic disturbance, and in fact, it's really dangerous to the living. The other thing that really interested me about this story was the role of women. There are two women in the story, just two. One is Miss Donahue, who is the to-be wife, who doesn't really take a part, but she's really fundamental. And then there's the woman who was killed, who was to do with the jester. This is a story set in Ireland. Now, he wasn't Irish. He'd set a couple of his stories in Ireland. Let's think about it from an Irish point of view. So when you go back into Irish myth and story, you have this idea of sovereignty, and it's in Celtic story. It's also in Welsh myth. It appears in Breton stories, and it is transformed. And there's the idea of the Fisher King. All right, let's unpack this, because it's not necessarily complicated. It's just a lot of detail. So for the ancient Celts, their leader, it wasn't just that he happened to be. He didn't inherit actually from father to son in Celtic law. There was the Taoiseach in Irish, which is he was drawn from a kin group rather than he wasn't just the son of the king. But it was really important for the king to be unblemished and pure. Why? Because if he was blemished, he was seen symbolically as part of the land. He married the land. Therefore, if he was blemished in some way, the land would not be fertile and the tribes would die. So that's really deeply psychologically important. That is a window into the Stone Age, that kind of thinking. The king must be unblemished. And you have a king who was no other Argid Love in Old Irish, I'm still pronouncing the, you see, which died out by about the 13th century. So anyway, who in Welsh is Nydd or Llydd Llaw Eraint, who has a silver hand. And the silver hand was created for him because he lost his hand in a battle, I think, and it had to be created to make him whole again, because he couldn't be a king if he was blemished and lost his hand, because therefore if he was a king, he would not be fertile in the land. And this is what's behind the myth of the Fisher King, who's wounded in the groin, which of course relates to fertility as well. So the Fisher King in Arthurian stories, in his castle, the land is poisoned. This comes up in T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland as well. The land is poisoned because the king is blemished. The king is not in right relationship with the land. That's really important. And you've got to think of these things as being symbolic. It's not just about him marrying the queen, who is the land. So the queen is the land. So when we get to this story, the land is symbolized by the Irish woman, Miss Donahue. And this is an American man who's come in. He's a usurper. He's come in with his money and he's bought and he's claiming sovereignty on this part of Ireland, and that's why he's worried that the Irish lads will take it out of him, because they actually, at one point, Carnacki thinks the Irish lads are kicking his head in, doesn't he? And that is what that's about, that he is not rightful heir to the land. And if you are not the rightful king and rightfully joined to the land, which is personified as a woman, sovereignty is always a woman. Sir Gawain meets the loathly woman in Inglewood Forest, and he has to correctly divine her nature and what she wants in order to be in correct relationship with her, because she as a woman symbolizes fertility. She symbolizes the well-being, future. There's going to be crops, there's going to be children, and therefore there will be a future for our tribe. And if that goes wrong, and if the sovereignty is symbolically not right by a king who is blemished, or a king who does not possess the land properly, because there's something wrong with him, then all of that is threatened. And it may feel that it's a dump at the end. We get this story of this king Erinor, who is satirized by the jester. We need to say something about the role of the bards and satire. I'm not sure how much Hope Hodgson knew about this as Celtic culture and history, and Irish culture and history, or whether he was kind of just channeling it. But it's absolutely bob on, as they say, in its terms of understanding. It's correct that you have to rightfully possess sovereignty by the consent of the land. That's important as well. The land has to consent to you as the king, and it's not going to take you if you're blemished, and I said that. Now, one of the things of the Celtic bards was they had two functions. So in Celtic traditions, and we know this from Caesar and the Gauls and Druids in Gaul, but the Druids are also in Ireland and Britain. And there were three levels of Druids, and one is the Druid, who's the top dude, and he's like a priest, and then there's the Bard, who's the storyteller and the poet, and then the Vates or the Wates, and they exist in Irish tradition, and less so we have the Bards and the Druids in Welsh tradition, but it's clearer in the Irish stories because they're less corrupted by later influence, although they are corrupted. So the function of the bard has two functions. First, the praise poem. And in early Welsh and Irish literature, there's lots of praise poems about these leaders. They're brave, they're wonderful, they're heroic, they're generous, all the good things. And that is, the leader is elevated. Now, the downside of that was that the bards could compose satire. And it was feared. It wasn't just like that poem, that guy's written a nasty poem about me. It was your downfall if the poet satirized you and humiliated you. It was the bard. If the bard did that, it was a serious thing. So what we're saying is, because this king was satirized by the poet, by the bard, he is no longer fit to have sovereignty. Do you see what I'm saying? He is blemished. His reputation is sullied. He is not the rightful king to be married to the woman of the land anymore. And that's what this story's about. So underneath it all, what I'm suggesting is there is a theme that the king is unwhole, he's not whole, either in body or in reputation. He's not a good man, and therefore he is not the rightful king to have the consent of the land, and the land is crying out that he is not the right king, and it is wrong. But it has its tongue cut out. The land cannot speak to us, so it speaks as this mouth, this horrific mouth. So that's what this is about. This is a story of sovereignty, and the sin here is that a man who is not rightful, who is not wholesome, he does not have the qualities of the king, he is not the rightful heir. This is a sin that happened way back in time. And it may be now that the story is being retold that our man Tassoc is the rightful heir and will rightfully marry Miss Donahue, who represents Ireland. Yeah. And that's what I think it's about. So it is amazing how you can get all these things out of a story. But I think I'm right with all these things. You may find other things. Of course, the great things about stories are that you sometimes find things that I don't. And that happens in the notes quite a lot. People say, what do you think about this? I go, How did I miss that? But I do miss things. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. I thought it was a pretty good story. And now I've got to edit this video without going terribly wrong. And I've got to be the wholesome, worthy narrator married to the video in order. And if the video refuses me, as she seems to be doing, it could go all wrong. Anyway, you shall be the judges.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?